Thanks very much indeed, Toby, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this frankly rather damp afternoon here in Leicester. But I hope we can stick with the old Chinese idea that lots of rain means good luck, positivity, and various other things that will compensate for being soaked to the skin. In the course of today, what I want to do is talk about one city in particular, but I'll try and indicate various ways in which I hope the experience of that city may be indicative perhaps of some wider trends and ideas. And that city, which you see named for you here, the city of Chongqing in southwest China, is a place where over the years I've spent a certain amount of time, and I continue to believe that its history is something that deserves to be understood, appreciated, and possibly even enjoyed well beyond the confines of those who work on Chinese history. So let us start with a brief consideration of what this place is and why it might matter. And I will start here with an image which I have had with me for some time, but which I've continued to find very, very indicative and important in some ways. It's an image from the front of a DVD box or from a Chinese television documentary. The subject of the television documentary is the Second World War in China. And these documentaries will be familiar to any of you who've watched a bit of late night TV. It is never, it can be said, I think, that on British TV, you are never more than 10 minutes away from a documentary about the late and unlamented Adolf Hitler, or some aspect of the Third Reich, or the Soviet Union, or even the Japanese in the Pacific, will be present at some time on some satellite channel far down the list of programme guides. Channel number 354, I think, is usually a good one to go for on these. But that continuing 70-year plus long fascination that we certainly have in this country, in the UK, for the history of the Second World War, has very rarely extended to the subject of China and its role in that wartime period. And that's one of the reasons why I found this DVD artwork on the cover of the box such an interesting choice. I should say, by the way, I've suddenly realised for the majority of this audience, who I think are undergraduate students, a DVD is a sort of historical artifact that used to exist about the same time as tablets in Babylonian ancient world, where material was gathered and stored. And if you go to various museums, you may find one or two of them still around. But this came out in the early 2000s, at a time when DVDs were still more widely used. And it's a documentary about the wartime experience of the great cities, the great urban centres of the Allied capitals. And the symbolism here with the buildings is fairly obvious. On the left-hand side, part of the Victoria Tower of the Houses of Parliament in London. In between, the clock in Red Square, representing Moscow and the Soviet Union. Here, of course, the US Capitol building and the power of the United States. But on the right-hand side, we have an icon, a monument, which I suspect is less well known, less familiar, certainly in the Western world. Does anyone here know what it is? Except Toby, who I think knows quite well what it is, but others. Anyone from China here? Anyone who's willing to admit being from China here? I think we do have some people who say yes. I think we have a Chinese friend in the audience there. 你好，这个是什么?
It's kind of a memory, kind of memorial.
Yeah.
In Chongqing.
Indeed. Have you seen it?
No.
Okay, you've never seen it. Okay. So in that case, I have a kind of audience on the same level of knowledge of this particular item. But our friend at the back from China is quite right. This is a monument. It sits in the city of Chongqing, known in the West in the past as Chongqing, in southwest China. And it is a memorial to what in China is still known as the War of Resistance against Japan, the Sino-Japanese War, or the Chinese phase of World War II, to those of us who look more from the outside world. And I'm going to talk during the course of today a bit more about what that war meant for the city of Chongqing and how it changed the urban landscape, but also the self-perception of the city. But at this stage, all I want to say, or to put in your minds, is that in recent Chinese popular history, this sort of television documentary is just one example of a wider phenomenon. Chongqing, which was the temporary wartime capital of China during World War II, between the years 1937 and 1946, I think, technically, Toby, is that right? For nearly a decade. During that time, the Chinese themselves, or many of the Chinese, regarded the city as being just as much one of the Allied wartime capitals as people living in London, in Washington, or in Moscow. The fact that, in retrospective history, that memory has not lasted as it has for the other capitals is an intriguing and I think important story about the way in which the history of cities and the history of the war is remembered and forgotten. But what this documentary shows is that this history today and in recent years is still very much in the minds of many in China. And I think there is an enthusiasm to try and transmit or expand an understanding of that history to the wider world. So to understand how we get there, we need to know a bit about what the history is that is being put forward. And before I talk in more detail, as I'd like to do later, about the specific city, the city of Chongqing, briefly how it came to be China's wartime capital, and what happened to the city during the years of the war, I need to just fill you in very, very briefly on the history that led up to that period in the 1930s. So the period of the early 20th century, the period which culminated, at least in this particular historical narrative, culminated with the outbreak of war between China and Japan. To put it very simply, one could say was fueled by two major ideological trends or thrusts during the early 20th century. One of those thrusts comes from the mainland of Northeast Asia, from China, and that is the force of Chinese nationalism. As many of you will know, but perhaps just to remind you, the late 19th century had seen China overall in a very difficult, very vulnerable state. The invasions and occupations from the Western powers, the Opium Wars of the 1840s, 1860s, the increasing incursions from Russia, France, Britain, and eventually Japan in the late 19th, early 20th centuries had made China a vulnerable country in the world community. It was never a full colony in the way that India was, or large parts of Africa, but there was no doubt that after the assault from the outside world, and particularly from the Western world, China did not control its own sovereignty, did not control its own rights to decide on taxation or finance, or indeed simple matters of whether people could proselytize Christianity or not. These now became part of an imperial system of government within China itself. And as a reaction to this, in the early 20th century, you have a much stronger sense, particularly amongst China's youth, patriotic circles, merchants, newly emergent urban classes, very much a city-based story, that a new spirit of ideological nationalism came around. Particularly after the last emperor was overthrown at the beginning of 1912, China became a republic, and the idea of a sort of civic nationalist republicanism became very much part of the Chinese story. Many young Chinese talked about Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, the personification of the idea of scientific technology and popular political participation that were supposed to regenerate China and to prevent it, in a phrase of the time, from being carved up like a melon between the various different imperial powers. So during that time, we see various Chinese nationalists beginning to come to power, perhaps the most significant of them at that time being Sun Yat-sen, great Chinese revolutionary who was behind the establishment of China's nationalist party, the Kuomintang. His successor, Chiang Kai-shek, who would become China's president and ruler through the mid-20th century, and a little bit in the wings, but waiting to come to power later, a young man named Mao Zedong. In the 19-teens, 1920s, he had a pretty humble job. He was a library assistant at Peking University. As I'm sure you all know, within a couple of decades, he would rise rise to a rather higher position as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and ruler of the People's Republic of China. So the emergence of this greater nationalist consciousness on the Chinese mainland in the early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, into the 1930s, is one ideological force that shapes the era in Asia. The other one, inconveniently because I brought a map that's slightly insufficient, is just off the right-hand side, in the shape of Japan. And that other ideological force was the growing strength of Japanese imperialism. Japan also had become vulnerable to the West in the late 19th century, but its reaction was very different from China's. Japan modernized very quickly. It sort of pushed back against the arrival of Russians, Americans, perhaps more than the British, actually, in the case of the Japanese. The Americans, the Russians were really the ones who pushed hard. And for various reasons, Japan was able to reconstitute itself much more quickly and effectively from a pre-modern state in which the skills of the samurai sword were very central to the customs of governance and rule in Japan, to actually becoming one of the fastest modernizing countries in the world. After a period known as the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s and after, Japan quickly developed a conscripted army, a new Western-style constitution, the growth of light and then heavy industry, and above all of these, or on top of all of these, it had the other additional factor that made you a first-rate power in the late 19th, early 20th century, which was an empire of its own. As it became strong, and as the Japanese force of its own nationalism grew, it began to expand onto the Asian maritime and then mainland areas of potential conquest. So, to do a kind of rapid fire through this, by 1895, at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, Taiwan became a Japanese colony and would remain so till 1945. 1905, Japan fought a war against Russia, first time that an Asian power had defeated a Western power. As a result, large parts of northeast China, known in those days as Manchuria, came under partial or complete Japanese influence. 1910, the bit in grey on the right-hand side, Korea becomes a Japanese colony. And then through the 1920s, greater expansion of a sort of informal but pretty proactive kind in northern China. And then in 1931, the invasion and occupation of all of Manchuria, the northeast of China, area the size of France and Germany combined. So by the time you get to the mid-1930s, very large parts of the map, particularly in the northeast and down on the Korean Peninsula and down to the south there with Taiwan, are in Japanese hands. So, in brief summary, these are the reasons why these two forces, an increasingly more nationalist China that feels it wants to get back its own sovereignty, control its own affairs under Chiang Kai-shek, and on the other side, an increasingly militaristic Japan, which abandons multi-party democracy in the early 1930s and becomes much more of a militaristic, expansionist power. And by the time you get to the mid-1930s, the stage was set for a sort of clash between the two. Very few things are inevitable, but certainly the ability of China to maintain the idea that it must strengthen its own sovereignty and Japan's determination to conquer the Asian mainland made this a very, very difficult combination of powers to have in the same geographical space. By the mid-1930s, China's politics had adapted to take account of this impending clash. I've mentioned both Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. Again, without getting to the whole history of it, it's worth knowing that in the 1920s, the relationship between China's communists and China's nationalists was a sort of on-off kind of interaction. Through the mid-1920s, the much smaller Communist Party cooperated with the much bigger Nationalist Party with Soviet assistance to try and reunify and conquer large parts of China under one government. But once that government had been set up in 1927, 1928, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, turned on the Soviets, turned on his communist allies, massacred large numbers of them, and forced them to flee to the interior of China, by the mid-1930s, they would go, and some of you may have heard the term, on the Long March, retreating from inner China way up into the northwest, where they would lick their wounds and try and regather. And one of the things that saved the Chinese communists and actually changed the future of Asia was that a small communist party on the run, forced on the Long March, was given a breathing space by the increasing approach of war with Japan, which essentially forced a compromise between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and the communists, not then under Mao, although Mao was an important figure, but he wasn't the leader at the time. And they agreed in a very uneasy way by about 1936 to come together in the event of a war against Japan, which turned out not to be very long in coming. It was a bit, the eventual outbreak of war was a little bit like Sarajevo, 1914, for those many of you, I'm sure, who know the history of the Great War in Europe. In other words, a single unplanned incident that set off a chain of other consequences. So in Sarajevo, the shooting of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a series of alliances which, within a few weeks, led to the outbreak of total war in Europe. In China, the event that set off essentially the Asian phase of what would become World War II happened because of some soldiers going missing in a garrison just outside Beijing, about 30 miles from the centre, a little village called Wanping, at a place nicknamed by Westerners the Marco Polo Bridge, supposedly because Marco Polo had written about it in his medieval memoir or early modern memoir, I suppose, of visiting China. A clash between local Japanese garrisoned troops and Chinese troops suddenly expanded in July 1937 into a much bigger, much more savage war, as Japan basically used this sort of small clash to make demands for further territorial concessions within China. Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader, and he left a very extensive diary, so we can now read his thoughts as to what he was thinking at the time, made it clear that this time he would not make any concessions as he had done over Manchuria and some of these other places in the 20s and 30s. This time he was going to stand firm and say no to the Japanese. And as a result, within days and weeks, in July, August, September of 1937, all-out war broke out, first near Beijing, as we've said, where it started, and then with a second front being opened by Chiang at Shanghai, in particular, the great port city of eastern China, leading to a rapid series of conflagrations in cities and countryside all across eastern and central China. And during that period, the war carried on and expanded in all sorts of very painful and very horrific ways. And again, if you read Toby Lincoln's book, you will know that the city of Wuxi in the Yangtze Delta was one area that, at least initially, was very badly hit by this particular outbreak of war. But it's not the city of Wuxi that I plan to speak about now, not least because Toby is the expert and no doubt can speak to its experience in much more detail than I ever could. I want to talk a little bit about the city that became the centre of resistance to the Japanese invasion for the next 8 years. And that's the city of Chongqing, I mentioned, which on the map you'll find just there. We don't have a little laser pointer or anything, do we, Toby? Or I suppose...
No, this is one lying around today.
No, okay, in that case I shall have to go with the power of the human finger. In that case, you'll have to forgive me indicating here. When Chiang Kai-shek and his government were thinking in the 1930s about the possibility of a war with Japan, which they knew might be imminent, they thought it might not come until as far off as the 1940s, but they were fairly sure that at some point there would have to be a confrontation with Japan. They made plans for what would happen in the event of such a war, because they knew that China was weaker, much more agrarian, much less technologically advanced than Japan, and therefore any war with Japan would initially almost certainly lead to a necessary retreat of Chinese troops. In fact, the idea that Chinese troops would move inland and trade land for time, in one of the phrases of the time, was a fairly well understood military strategy. The idea would be that over time allies would come to the assistance of China and eventually Japan would be defeated by China in an alliance of other countries, which in a sense is of course actually what happened in World War II, but not quite in the way that Chiang Kai-shek would have anticipated. However, what this meant was that planning had to go on as to what was going to happen to the power base of the national government of China. Now, I mentioned that Chiang Kai-shek, originally with his communist allies, who he then turned on and massacred at the end of the 1920s, had managed to reunify large parts of eastern China. And one of the things that his government did was to move the capital from Beijing, where it had been for several hundred years, down to Nanjing, or Nanking as it was sometimes known, in central China. This was because Nanjing was basically much more in the centre of the nationalist government and nationalist party's power base. It was also close to Shanghai, major international centre, and a more dependable area in which they could keep their government going. But Nanjing was a great peacetime capital. It was a very, very vulnerable place, a very difficult place to be in the circumstances of a major war. And therefore, plans were made for a whole variety of possibilities for the capital. Some people, even during the war actually, and I think, Toby, you've done something on this, haven't you, were looking at the city of Xi'an in central China. But that wasn't the one that they chose. Xi'an has various problems. It's in the middle of lowest plains. It's not very easy to access by river. No. What they decided was to go for this place here, city of Chongqing. Why Chongqing? Whole variety of reasons. First of all, probably not because of the fantastic facilities or infrastructure of the city. Compared to Shanghai, which even Westerners who came to China in the 1910s and 20s thought was one of the most glamorous places on earth. The expression to be Shanghaied, which is not always a compliment, nonetheless has a sort of sneaking admiration about it, the idea of people who are smarter than you are perhaps, that can outdo you. Certainly the idea of Shanghai as a place which was lit up by powerful neon lights, which had all sorts of nationalities there, a cosmopolitan city. This was a very different sort of Chinese city, even in the 1920s and 30s, from Chongqing. Chongqing, right in the interior, middle of sort of Sichuan province, essentially. An old city, not a new place, a long history behind it, but much less developed in terms of buildings. Wasn't on the railway at that point, marked by certain topographical details that made it difficult to operate in peacetime, but paradoxically rather well set up for war, because Chongqing is on cliffs. It basically sits at the confluence of two great rivers, the Yangtze and the Jialing, and to get to the city itself, I mean, nowadays you'd use a cable car or get on a motorbike or drive a car. In the 1910s, 1920s, there was a huge industry of sedan chair carriers who would take you from the port down at the bottom at the water level on the Yangtze or the Jialing and take you up physically the hillside, a pretty damn steep hillside, to the city itself. So it's a sort of trading centre that's not the ideal kind of place that you would want to place yourself in terms of core China coastal trade. On the other hand, if you're about to start a very long war, which you don't know is whether your allies are going to support you or not, or whether you have any allies, then being in a city that is very defensible from the water and the land is very helpful to do. So this is one of the things, particularly about 1935, as a national commission was set up by Chiang Kai-shek and his government to try and work out where would be the most effective place to relocate the capital to in case of a war. Chongqing stood very heavily amongst the list of favourites. There were problems. I mean, first of all, the question of how you would actually get people down there in that circumstance. Secondly, the fact that it had very little industrial infrastructure, so a plan was set up under something called the National Resources Commission to try and move more industry and capacity for industrial production of chemicals, metals, armaments and so forth down to the area around Chongqing. And also third, and perhaps most importantly, the very unfortunate reality that Chiang Kai-shek and his government didn't actually run Chongqing. It was an area that was under the control of one of the so-called warlords, militarist leaders, a man called Liu Xiang, who basically controlled the whole area around here in Sichuan province as his own sort of personal fiefdom. Technically, he was allied to the national government, but in fact, he pretty much ran it as he saw fit himself. So, relocating to that particular place for a long wartime period when essentially the national government would dominate over the local provincial government, had all sorts of political difficulties inherent within it. Nonetheless, the plans were put into place, and when the war did actually break out in the summer of 1937, the move began. And it was a heroic, people talk about the Long March of the communists in the 1930s to this day. People have forgotten what you might call the long river trip that was necessary to take huge numbers of people, thousands of government employees, thousands of workers, millions of refugees, of course, coming from the devastation of the invasion in eastern China, 800 miles up the Yangtze River to Chongqing. And I'll show you some images in just a little while that show some of that. It was one of the great movements of people, refugees for the most part essentially, to relocate themselves for they knew not how long in the centre of China in anticipation of a long war of resistance against the invasion from Japan. And as a result, many aspects of the city reflected that move. We have here a couple of rather sort of hardcore pictures taken from a wonderful book, Popular Culture in Wartime China, by Jiang Taihong, showing cartoons done by newspaper columnists at the time. The one at the top, a rather distressing and disturbing and, of course, racially caricatured image of a Japanese soldier. And below, perhaps rather finer and rather more subtle, a piece by the famous woodcut artist Feng Zikai showing the bombing of a small school. So the press at this time in Chongqing very much putting forward the idea that there's a war of resistance going on, and that being part of the press, part of the propaganda movement, is an important part of resistance against the invader. But although, of course, at that time, Chongqing was relatively isolated on these two rivers, up these cliffs, making it difficult to invade by land for the Japanese, the Second World War, which essentially was what had started at this point, had one very new method of warfare that hit Chongqing very hard. And that, of course, was the air raid. Chongqing was not the first place in the world to suffer air raids, but it was one of the first major cities to ever suffer this type of aerial bombardment. There were a few Zeppelin raids in World War I. There were colonial wars in Africa where a certain amount of aerial warfare was done against the indigenous populations. The Spanish Civil War, of course, Guernica, very famous image from the Spanish Civil War, also saw the use of aerial bombing. But Chongqing was essentially next in the queue. Several years before the, in the end, perhaps historically better remembered Blitz on London, for instance, Chongqing found itself repeatedly under fire, under attack from the air. And Chongqing, certainly compared to London just a couple of years later, was very difficult to defend from the air. The Chinese Air Force was very small, not adequate to the protection of the city from an aerial perspective, unlike the Royal Air Force in Britain a couple of years later. There was a certain amount of sort of anti-aircraft protection, but not very much. There wasn't a particularly well-developed system of air raid shelters, although that began to build up during the course of the war itself. And therefore, one of the greatest protections that Chongqing had was actually a natural one. Chongqing, then and now, is subject to very thick fog, particularly during the period from autumn up to spring. And that meant that air raids didn't happen very much in the autumn and winter months because it was too difficult for Japanese bombers to find the location, the target, and then hit it. But of course, once the mists and the fog had cleared by spring, it essentially left the city as a sitting target in which squadrons and formations of Japanese bombers could come and simply raid the city, both with conventional bombs, explosive bombs, and also incendiary bombs, which were particularly devastating because, of course, Chongqing, as a city that was not particularly well developed, had a lot of wooden buildings which caught fire very easily as part of that series of air raids. And air raids became a fairly constant part of life in Chongqing all the way from about spring 1938 until certainly into 1941, and then the last raids really happened in 1943. They were reduced after that because American Air Force assistance, which came in after Pearl Harbor, meant that it was more possible to defend the city against outside attack. But certainly this sort of scene of sort of day-to-day destruction of the city. On the 3rd and 4th of May of 1949, there was something like 27 consecutive raids on Chongqing over 2 days. The moment that it seemed to calm down, yet another squadron of Japanese bombers would come by, hitting the city again. It was a symbolically very important day, because those of you who know a bit of Chinese history will know that 4th of May 1919 was the date of one of the great patriotic student demonstrations in the centre of Beijing. They're still famous in China today, Wusi, the May 4th demonstrations. So to launch an air raid on the exact 20th anniversary of those nationalist demonstrations, 4th of May 1939, was a symbolically very powerful moment, and certainly Chinese writers such as the great writer Lao She wrote in very patriotic, very angry terms about how this particular patriotic anniversary was being defiled by this attack on their capital city. So arrangements were made, local health and relief associations that began to rescue people from the air raids. This sort of slightly higher shot from above, again showing a kind of typical scenes. And again, and I think pretty much everyone here will have seen pictures of London, Birmingham, Bristol after the Blitz in the 1940s. And therefore this sort of urban image is in a sense quite familiar to us who know that history. But it's worth reflecting that Chongqing certainly experienced this for several years before the war came to Europe. During the course of those years, however, while Chongqing continued to resist and was never actually occupied or conquered, the nationalist government at the time also used this as propaganda, essentially, to sell the idea of China as the first victim of the fascist powers, in this case Japan, that would eventually become part of an alliance that would fight back against the forces of dictatorship. China was, of course, a dictatorship in its own right, but it was a dictatorship on the Allied side eventually, and therefore was in a slightly different category in terms of understanding of the war. Pearl Harbor, of course, made the huge difference. Up to that point, and it took 4.5 years, remember, from July 1937 to December 1941, when China was essentially fighting on its own, although with more and more clandestine assistance from the British and the Americans by the end of that period, as they realized that war with Japan in Asia was very likely. But after that point, of course, China was able to form a formal alliance with the United States under President Roosevelt and the British Empire under Winston Churchill. And that meant that Chongqing then changed into a city that became essentially a centre for international diplomacy and intrigue. Plans were being made for what a post-war China would look like, in which the nationalist government had defeated the Japanese as part of the alliance and would be rebuilding China and making it into something very very different from what it had been before, literally rebuilding from the rubble and the ashes that you see here. And this next document is sort of one small example of a kind of wider trend that you see at the time. So this is from Chongqing Archives, and again, those of you who read Chinese can see what it is. On the right-hand side here, you can see that it's a report put forward by the Chongqing City Food Management Committee dealing with air raid damage to property after one of those air raids that I mentioned. Top, you've got a list of items that this chap has lost in an air raid. Bed, mattress, shoes, and then there's a list of what happened to them, completely destroyed, what the value of these things were, and how much compensation they should be given. So it's a small account of compensation being given for wartime damage, but a much bigger point of principle, which is the idea that the Chinese state, like other wartime states, was making much more demands on its wider population. Young men to be conscripted to go to the war, or taxation, that much higher taxes were being charged to the wider population to pay for the war effort, or essentially regulations on everything from personal behaviour to when you could keep your lights on or turn them off, or how you should behave in terms of guarding against spying or infiltration. So in other words, a lot more government control of the wider population. But as in Britain and the US, this produced a sort of counter-reaction, which was the idea that the state should also be providing more for the population. Now, eventually, the beneficiaries of this trend became, as you will know, the Chinese communists under Mao, who provided the most transformative, in the strict sense of that word, certainly most devastating change in terms of the way in which a collective society was formed in China. But some of the indications of that turn can be seen in this document, where the national government in Chongqing is taking responsibility for the air raid damage done to some of its population, its officials, and at least acknowledging that, however inadequate, there is a role for government in providing some sort of welfare provision and compensation for people who have suffered in the war as part of the national war effort. So you see, in other words, not just a city that's being devastated by air raids, but also a city that is thinking about itself as a seat of government that is trying to think ahead to the reconstruction of society after the war. And again, it's no surprise that in a more abstract sense, or more abstract but perhaps more high-level sense, people such as civil servants in China were reading about what the Americans and the British were doing. There's a great article by the historian Yun Ma at Sheffield University about the way in which the Chinese politicians at the time, political thinkers, what they thought of the Beveridge Plan, the British plan that eventually came up with the welfare state in its post-war form. And in fact, this was being read and approved of and widely discussed amongst policy circles in China at the time, an indication of the quite transnational influences that helped to shape this idea of the Chinese state changing during the course of the war. So a few more indications here of various ways in which this sort of new relationship between urban society and the wider political parties changed. A kind of making work relief scheme for refugees from inland China making their way up to Chongqing and areas around for the duration of the war. Torchlight parade of women basically being brought into this idea that all parts of society, not just soldiers, but society as a whole, should mobilize and be part of a wartime propaganda effort. Images here of Chinese troops going up to the front during wartime. And all members of society, even the youngest, being brought into the mobilization. Here we have young little cadets, as it were, training. So let me bring, in a sense, the wartime story to an end, so I can spend a few minutes talking about the aftermath before we perhaps go to a bit of discussion and questions. And I think this image is a useful one to try and summarize some of the change that emerges from that Chongqing moment, that period when Chongqing was the temporary wartime capital of China. The symbolism is in another city, not Chongqing, but Cairo, as I've said here at the top. On 1st of December 1943, the Cairo Conference ended. The Cairo Conference was one of about 15 or 16 major Allied wartime conferences during the course of the Second World War. It is the only one in which this particular gathering of people came together, the only one in which the Chinese leader is treated as an equal with the American president and the British Prime Minister. So you see images there, President Roosevelt, as ever, his polio carefully hidden for the cameras. Winston Churchill in a rather fetching white safari suit. And on the left-hand side, Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader. And on the far right, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sung Mei-ling, Chiang's American-educated wife who spoke fluent English and was essentially his English language interpreter to the elite politicians of the world. So this moment was in a sense one that symbolized China's ending of its colonial state or semi-colonial status, the idea that there were all these special rights that the Westerners had on Chinese territory, and instead the signing of a whole group of new treaties which treated China as a sovereign, equal state. Now in 1943, despite this conference in Cairo, of course, China was still in the middle of this terrible war, which would not end for another 2 years. But the concession or the agreement had been made by the Americans, by the British, that once the war was over, China would regain its sovereign status. And that, in a sense, came as the reward, the acknowledgement of China's wartime effort fighting the Japanese. And as the Chinese themselves pointed out, they, having started in 1937, 4.5 years before the Americans actually entered the war in Asia. The war itself, some of you have been kind enough to read my book on the war, I think Toby said, and more broadly speaking, it's a long and quite complex and in some ways rather tragic story that one could argue that Chiang Kai-shek ended up winning the war in China, or at least was on the winning side certainly, but lost the country because the price that they had to pay was increasing brutalization in both city and countryside, a great kind of political splitting, with extreme divisions between the communists, nationalists, and also the collaborators with the Japanese. And by the time the war ended in 1945, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing was really not fit for its governing purpose. Within 3 years, a civil war had broken out between the nationalists and the rival communists under Mao Zedong, ending, as we know, with the victory of the communists in China in 1949, and the hasty departure of Chiang and the nationalists to the island of Taiwan, from where he never managed to regain the conquest of the mainland. But nonetheless, and that's one of the reasons why much of the story I've told you, I think, has never really become part of the wider global narrative of World War II. In the Western world, China's contribution, particularly under a defeated leader in the end, Chiang Kai-shek, who lost the mainland, wasn't really part of a kind of glorious narrative of Allied virtue and victory in defeating the Axis powers. But in China, things were even worse, because the last thing that Mao Zedong's communist government wanted to do after 1949 was to acknowledge the contribution of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists in defeating the Japanese. So the city that became the center of Chinese communist official history was Yan'an in northwest China, the communist headquarters, or Mao's headquarters, during the war years. Whereas the history of Chongqing and all the things I've mentioned, the great move of people down the Yangtze River, the establishment of a government, temporary government, the air raids, or the kind of social welfare and changes that came from that archival document, all of this was essentially sent underground. People talked about it and whispered about it in families, perhaps, but it was not part of the official narrative of the war in communist China. So fast forward about 30 or 40 years to the 1980s, 1990s, the early 2000s. Chongqing's history, having been hidden for the reasons I've mentioned, and really forgotten in the Western world, started to reappear in a really pretty major way in China. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s had for many people finally discredited the radical form of communism which he introduced in China. And instead, by the 80s and 90s, China was turning back to a much more patriotic form of nationalism in which both the communists and their old nationalist rivals had a role to play. And part of that was a very political thing because China was very keen to reunify with Taiwan and thought that by being a little bit more generous about the history of the Chinese nationalists on Taiwan, they might encourage that reunification. And as a result, the history of that part of China that I showed you on the map before, Chongqing city and Sichuan province surrounding it, became suddenly officially permitted and very widely discussed in many parts of China. Things like this book, 一个人的抗战, One Man's War of Resistance Against Japan, which is the exhibition catalogue from a private collector, a man named Fan Jianchuan, living outside Chengdu, not far from Chongqing, the city of Chengdu, which collects a lot of memorabilia, a lot of different souvenirs, helmets and so forth from the wartime years. But these concentrate on the nationalist war effort and not the communist. Here we have a picture of the great exodus of people in steamships up the Yangtze, fleeing the invasion of Japan in eastern China and making their way up the river in these Minsheng steamers to Chongqing. Again, stories that were not really told until the 1990s in a full form because they related to people going to Chongqing in the nationalist area and not to Yan'an in the communist area. An image here of an unknown soldier from, as the Chinese caption says, Sichuan province, again the area surrounding Chongqing, making a big point about the contribution that the local provincial army had made to the eventual defeat of Japan. And this brings us back, near the end, to that image that I started with. And you might see now, I think, why I want to bring this DVD up. Because, in many ways, Chongqing has been rediscovering its own history. Part of this wider permission, this wider unspoken authorization to speak about the wartime years and the Chinese nationalist Kuomintang contribution to the war alongside the communists has been that Chongqing has been allowed to rediscover its own history. And in producing programs like this, it's sending, I think, two messages. One is international, one is domestic, you might say. The international one is about wanting to make sure that Chongqing's war effort is remembered alongside the much better remembered efforts of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire in defeating the Axis during World War II. And I think it's simply a statement of fact to say that in the Western world, that Chinese side of things is either little understood or not taken very seriously in most general histories of war, at least until relatively recently. But there's also a domestic message, which is about Chongqing's rediscovery and pride in its own history during this period, a period when, for just less than a decade, Chongqing wasn't just a significant Chinese city, or even today as it is, a sort of major trading centre and centre for development and reconstruction, but actually a national capital, the capital of nationalist China, at a time of great national peril, when Chongqing was a city that led the resistance to the Japanese invasion, and whatever the provocations, the air raids, the black marketeering, the corruption, the destruction of much of the civic life of the city during that period, it nonetheless never fell to invasion and managed, partly through its own efforts, partly through the good graces of the alliance with the Western powers, to remain a city of resistance until the end of the war years. That history resonates very strongly in Chongqing today. You can see it in museums. You can see it in public art. You can see it in films. You may not know that, or you may know, that just a year or so ago, 2016, a movie about those Chinese air raids, a sort of blockbuster movie, was made and released in Chinese cinemas. To give it international flavour, they actually hired Bruce Willis to play a sort of American visitor to Chongqing during those years, giving that kind of international Hollywood glamour touch to this particular Chinese story. It's a symbol in the sense that this story of Chongqing in its wartime years is almost more powerful now than it was in the immediate aftermath of the war, in a sort of race for lost time to reclaim that part of history. And that's why I think understanding the significance of Chongqing as an urban centre today, and bear in mind it is one of China's most important urban centres in the present day, necessitates us, I think, going back to this very significant period of urban history when it was the wartime capital, and seeing how the experience of the 1930s links, not by any means in a straight and simple way, but certainly quite closely and in a way that one can trace all the way up to the present day. All right, thanks very much.